Bedfordshire, because it's a fairly small county, has over the years been quite an important county for botanists and botanical recording. So it was within the scope of individuals to get to know the county very well and to get to know the entire flora, which would be much more difficult if you were looking at, I don't know, Devon or Yorkshire or, you know, great massive areas. So a very compact little county, and also a county with very distinctive rock types, which lead to various kind of different sort of floras developing on different parts of the county. So if you go, you know, from the very south, you know, you've got the clay capping on the chalk, then you've got the chalk, and then you've got the galt clay, and then you've got the green sand, and then you've got the, you know, the Bedford clays for for the brick making areas, and then right in the very far northwest you have the limestones of the villages around sort of Harrold and that area. So all of those areas had a very distinctive flora in a small part of England. So that made it quite a popular county for sort of small scale kind of ecologists and people to start working on the plant life. And of course the best known of those, who was active for most of the 20th century, was John Dony. And John Dony was a historian. He was a school teacher. He was the honorary keeper of botany here at Wardown Museum. And he started recording plants in the 1920s, 1930s. He wrote the definitive flora of the county in the early 1950s, and then published plant maps showing the distributions and so on later on. And his final piece of work was The Wildflowers of Luton, which he published, or was published posthumously. He worked on it until the year before he died, which was in 1991. So he was a really great local character, and of course he had the John Dony Centre named after him up at Bushmead. And he was interested in not only the native species, but one of the things he was particularly keen on was what were known as wool aliens. Now, wool aliens were species that were found in the Bedfordshire fields because they imported a lot of wool from Australia, and the unusable bits that couldn't be sort of spun were used as a soil conditioner and so on in the fields, and it was known as shoddy. That's where the word shoddy comes from. If we talk about something being shoddy, it means not very good. So the wool that was not very good and couldn't be used for anything was used in the fields instead, so it would help break up the clays and so on. And of course that had all the seeds in it that had come in from places like Australia and New Zealand, where this wool had come from initially. So during that period, there were all these unusual plants growing in the fields that had ultimately come from the other side of the world, which was really quite exciting. But although that was of great academic interest, we do have a lot of problems these days with more invasive species. Some of those are not native. We have things like the giant hogweed, which we don't have too much of in Luton, but that came from the Caucasus region and is very toxic and can blister the skin. We have the Himalayan balsam, which naturally came from Asia and has advanced along the river in the last 20 years or so. And we have other plants which are significantly infesting some of the water meadow areas, such as Canadian goldenrod, which is another very invasive foreign species. So part of the conservation work that we have to carry out is keeping control of some of those aliens and John Dony was very much a recorder of the botany, and I'm more of a practical conservationist in terms of identifying what needs to be done and then using contractors and volunteers and so on to actually go out and deliver it. And that's why we need to keep control of these things, because they can cause all sorts of problems if we don't.
Did any of the invasive species that you mentioned come in to Luton via other means than the wool?
Probably all of the ones I mentioned. Right. I think most of the what were known as the wool aliens have more or less died out now. I don't think they became, horribly invasive. I think they had their time, and once the population of seed was no longer being added to, they didn't become established necessarily. But yeah, Victorian plantsmen generally were scouring the world for plant species and bringing them back to England in general. A lot of them were planted in the big landed estates. We also had issues with animal introductions, which have become pest species as well. Obviously the grey squirrel and the muntjac deer being two of them, which again had a local provenance in the Woburn area, for example. So that kind of thing was very important, and as I said, a lot of them were brought in originally because they were interesting plants for people to stick into their gardens and in the big estates. Especially the giant hogweed, for example. that can become, I don't know, maybe 12 foot tall, something like that. It's a really substantial plant, and in a setting like a landscaped estate, it's an impressive looking plant, but it became a nuisance, and it clogged up a lot of waterways and in the eastern counties, and became a really serious pest. People were getting, sort of damaged skin because it has these photosensitive sort of chemicals in it, which cause blisters and so on. And children would play with it, and they would get some, sort of terrible sores as a result of it. And only yesterday we were talking about hemlock, which is a plant which grows naturally and is a perfectly respectable native plant, but it's well known as a famous poison, hemlock, dating way back to classical times. And I was advising colleagues in the Parks Department that people need to be aware of it, and they need to cover themselves if they're cutting it down, because again, the sap, if it lands on their open skin, can be quite deleterious and cause reddening and possibly blisters. So those sorts of things are potentially a problem. As well as the ecological damage that some of these plants and things can produce when they literally crowd out the things that we traditionally would want to see along our rivers and riverside habitats.